Hello learners, hope you are doing well. So welcome to the week 3 grade assignment solution video. So without further ado, I think we should jump into the questions. The first question, the first code in fact is actually applicable to the first two questions. So let's read the code step by step. So at first we have initialized two variables A and B and initialized them to 0 in fact. And in the next step, we go into this while loop and we check if the table has more rows. And while we read the first row in table X, we check if the part of speech is a noun or, and this is very important to remember here, there's an or statement here, or the letter count is greater than 5, then we increment the value of A. So at this point, I think we should just jump to our first question. The first question is just what is the value of A representing at the end of execution, and what's given here is that it's a multiple select question. So let's go through the options one by one. So the first option says that it's the number of nouns with letter count greater than 5. So as you see here, we have asked the program in fact to increment the value of A each time it sees either a noun or if it sees any word with a letter count greater than 5. So which means that even if, say, it was a verb and it had a letter count greater than 5, it would be incremented, or the value of A would be incremented by 1. So which means that it's not just incrementing the value of nouns with letter count greater than 5. So this is not an answer, not the correct answer in fact. The next option is the number of nouns plus the number of words with letter count greater than 5. So again, when we say number of words with letter count greater than 5, we're also adding nouns. So we're not counting the nouns twice. So we're not just counting the number of nouns plus the number of words with letter count greater than 5. So again, this is not one of our answers. The next option says we are counting the number of nouns plus the number of words other than noun with a letter count greater than 5. Yes, that's true, because we're going to count all the nouns, be it lesser than 5 or greater than 5. We're going to count all the nouns. Along with that, if we find any other word other than a noun whose letter count is greater than 5, we're going to add it to the value of A. So which means that we have found our first correct option for question number 1. Anyway, since it's the multiple select question, let's go to the last option as well. So the last option says the number of words with letter count greater than 5 plus the number of nouns with letter count at most 5. So again, we are not counting anything with at most 5. Even if we have a noun, say, of 8 letters or 9 letters, if there was a noun like that, then we would still add that to the value of A. So which means that this option is also incorrect. So that means that for the first answer, the first question in fact, you have just one correct answer, which is your option number 3. So anyways, we have left the code incomplete in fact. Let's go back to the code. So the code after the if statement, if there are any words that do not match this criteria, what we do is we now come into this else statement. Pardon me. Yeah. So we come into this else statement, and here it says that if the letter count is greater than 3. So here it's not that any word that has not matched the criteria comes into the else statement. Here also there is a sort of let's say a condition. So here the condition is that whichever words do not match this criteria in the if statement, if it comes into this else statement, it should also match the criteria that its letter count should be greater than 3. Only in that case do we increment the value of B by 1. So again, now at this point, I think we should jump over to the second question. And here the question is what will B represent at the end of execution? And again, this is also a multiple select question. So let's go one option after the other. So the first option says we are counting the number of words with letter count greater than 3, but at most 5. So as you can see here, we're not counting all the words with letter count greater than 3, because if it's a noun, it would automatically go into this if statement, and there would never come an instance where a noun would have to come into this else statement. So which means that the option 1 is already incorrect. Pardon me, yeah. So let's go to the second option. Second option says it's the number of nouns with letter count greater than 3, but at least 5. Again, we would never have an option where the noun would have to enter this else statement, because all nouns would get into this if statement and increment the value of a. So again, this is also incorrect. Now the third option says we are counting the number of words other than noun with a letter count greater than 3 but at most 5. Again, this is the correct answer. Why? Because if you have a noun, it would automatically increment the value of a. So any word other than noun whose letter count is greater than 3, which is dictated by this statement, but at most 5, because any word that is greater than 5 would automatically go into this statement. So which means that you only have the option of the letter count being, the letter count being in this range. So this is the letter count that would actually increment all the value of b's, which means that this is one of the correct answers. So since it's a multiple select question, let's also move to the last option and see if we have a correct answer there as well. The number of words other than noun with letter count greater than 3 but at least 5. So at least 5 is where we have seen that this option becomes wrong, because as you all know that at most 5 would mean that the letter count should be lesser than or equal to 5. Yeah, but at least 5 means this would be the option, which means that you're counting all the letters that are greater than or equal to 5. But as you know that all the words with letter count greater than or equal to 5, or greater than 5 in fact, would increment the value of a and not b. So in that case, this option is also incorrect, which means that you only have one correct answer for question number 2, which is option number 3. So now we have solved question number 1 and 2, and the answer for question number 1 is option number 3, and the answer for question number 2 is option number 3 as well. Anyways, moving on to question number 3 here. So let's read the code for the third question. So in the first line, we have initialized both a and b, variables a and b, and initialized them to 0. And we have initialized a boolean variable called c, and its value is false. Now we get into this while statement. We say that while table 1 has more rows, we read the first row x in table 1, and if the gender is female, then we increment the value of a. So this is important to note, that if the gender is female, then we increment the value of a. So in this case, what we do is a would represent all the females in this data set. So that would be the value of a, the total number of females. Now we go into a second while loop, and since all the rows from table 1 have been moved to table 2, because at the end of execution of this first while loop, all the rows from table 1 would have moved to table 2. So now when we initialize the second while loop, we are now checking we are checking all the rows from table 2. So now we check all the rows in table 2, and we read the first row x in table 2, and then we check if the gender is not a female, which means if it's not a female, the only other option is that it's a male, and the city or town is Chennai. So all your males from Chennai, if you find a card that matches this criteria, and there's an AND statement, so both the criteria has to match on the same row, which means that you increment the value of b. So now, as you can see here, your value of b is all males from Chennai. Then you move this row to table 1. So now it doesn't matter, because we are not starting a new while loop as of now. So now what we see is, once we have done with this computations as well, this while loop, and we have completely updated the value of b, we compare a and b, and if a is greater than b, only then is c true. So the code asks us, when will c be true? So let's go through the options. So we see that if there exists more female students than Chennai students, so that's not true. So we know that A is the total number of female students, but B does not just contain Chennai students. It contains students who are both male and from Chennai. So the first option, as you can see here, is incorrect. The second option says if there exists more Chennai students than female students. Definitely not, because as you can see here, the female students are given more preference in the sense that we are checking if the female students are more. So automatically this option is also incorrect. The third option says if there exists more female students than male students. Again, that's not the case, because B is representing all male students who are from Chennai. So it's not all male students, because they could be male students from either Erode or any other part of India. So there could be a clash there as well. So definitely not the correct answer here as well. So the last option is if there exist more female students than male students from Chennai. Yes, this is the correct answer, because as you can see that A is representing all female students and B is representing all male students from Chennai, which means that if A has to be greater than B, then this is what the correct answer will come out to be. That means if there exist more female students than male students from Chennai. So the correct answer for question number 3 is option number 4. Anyways, let's move on to question number 4. So in the fourth question, it reads, in the words dataset, the procedure count words. So this is a procedure, count words. It counts the number of nouns with letter count greater than average number of letters per word. So it should be a noun and its letter count should be greater than the, it should be greater than the average letter count. So what it says is that assume that the variable average, that is AVG, holds the average number of letters per word. Choose the correct code fragments to complete the procedure, and also it's given that it's a multiple select question, so there may be more than one correct answers. So when we move into the code, we see that we have this procedure called count words, and we know what it has to do, because it's given in the question that it should count the number of nouns with a letter count greater than the average number of letters per word. So what we do first is we initialize this variable count to 0, and then we write a while loop in which we check if pile 1 has more cards. Then we read the top card X on pile 1. So here is what we have to fill from the options. And what happens is that once we do this particular procedure, we have to move this card to pile 2, and then once we complete this while loop and our computations are done, then we return the value of count. So count is the variable that has to be updated, and then we end the procedure count words. Okay, so let's move into the options. So the first option is if the part of speech is noun, and here we know that we have to count the number of nouns with letter count. Okay, so the first thing is that we have to count the number of nouns. So if the part of speech is a noun, so we have our first correct statement that is given to us. The second statement is, it's a nested if statement. It says that if the letter count is greater than the average. So we know that average holds the average number of letters per word, and what this procedure has to do is it has to count the number of nouns with letter count greater than the average number of letters per word. So again, if it's a noun, only then will it enter this nested statement. So which means that now we have to check if this noun that has entered the nested if statement has a letter count greater than the average, and then we increment the value of count. So in the first option itself, we have found our first correct answer. So let's not stop here because it's a multiple select question. Let's go to the second question, second option in fact. Now in the second option, we have said that if the letter count is greater than the average, then we go into this if statement, and if the part of speech is equal to noun, then we increment the value of count. So again, what is happening here is that first, in the first option, we checked for the part of speech if it was noun, and then we went into the if statement, and then we incremented the value of count if the letter count is greater than average. But here what we've done is we have just reversed the statements, the nested statements. We have said that if the letter count is greater than average, then we go into this if statement, and we check if the part of speech is a noun, only then do we increment the value of count. So both these statements are the same, because if the letter count is greater than average, it could be for any of the words, it could be for any of the part of the speech, it could be either for a verb, it could be for a noun, for an adjective, and whatnot. But only if it's a noun do we increment the value of count. So in this case we have just reversed the roles, but it still means the same thing. So again, this is our second correct answer. Now moving to the third option, because we may have more than one correct answer, we should still move on to the next option to see if we can get a correct answer there. So this says that if, and this is just a single if statement, it's not a nested if statement, it says if the letter count is greater than average and the part of speech is a noun, only then do we increment the value of count. Again, when we have a statement where we have to count two separate statements and both of these statements have to be true, in that case we have something called the AND operator, and this is what connects two statements or two conditions in fact, and only if both conditions come out to be true do we go into this if statement, which means that we need the letter count to be greater than the average and it should be a noun. So again, in that case, this is a correct answer. So let's go to the fourth option, which is the last option, and see if we get a correct answer there or we have to reject this. It says if the letter count is greater than average or. So the only difference here is we have an or statement, or the part of speech is a noun. So both the statements can be true, but even if one statement was false, we would still end up going into this if statement and increment the value of count. So for example, let's say if the letter count was less than the average letter count of the words in this data set and it was a noun, it would still go inside. So you would have a noun that was lesser than the average letter count. Or if we had an average letter count but the part of speech was, say, a verb, in that case still we would be entering this if statement. So we would have say a verb with the letter count more than the average letter count. So in that case this would not give us the correct answer, which means that this is incorrect. So in that case we have found three correct answers for question number 4, and the correct options are the option number 1, 2 and 3. So now moving on to question number 5. So let's read question number 5. It says the following pseudocode is executed using the scores dataset. What will be the value of z at the end of execution? And it's also given that it's a numerical answer type. So looking at this, most of the learners will now try to go to the dataset that's given to us and then individually find what they've asked us to find. But for this question, actually it's not required. It's more of a logical question than to test your computational speed. Anyway, let's go to the pseudocode. In the first line we have 4 variables, that is some t, some p, some m, some p and some c, all have been initialized to 0. Then we get into the cards. While pile 1 has more cards, you read the top card X in pile 1. Now this is where you have to do a little bit of logical reasoning. So the first line says that we are incrementing the value of some t by the total marks of that student, and this is done for every card. So at the end of execution, some t will have the sum of the total marks of all students. Similarly, we have some m which is incrementing itself every iteration by the match marks, the individual match marks of each student. So at the end of execution, the sum m will contain the sum of the individual match marks of all students. The same way for some p, it will contain the individual match marks of all the sum of the individual sum of the individual physics marks for all the students. And some c will have the sum of the individual chemistry marks for all students. And once you're done with the first card, you move to pile 2, and then this process repeats all over again. So at the end of execution, as you know, that some t, some m, some p and some c will have their respective total number of marks for either the total marks or the individual marks in either maths, physics or chemistry. So what's happening next is that we have this variable called z and we're initializing it to 0. And here we go into this if statement, and what we've been given here is that if the sum m plus sum p plus sum c divided by t, sum t, is greater than or equal to 1, then we increment the value of z by 1. So what are they asking here? They're asking us if the value of sum m, that is the total individual marks in mathematics, plus sum p, which is the total individual marks in physics, and sum c is the total individual marks in chemistry, that marks divided by the sum of the total marks of all students, which is sum t, should be greater than or equal to 0 for us to enter this if statement. So let's think about this logically for a moment. So if I were to add the sum total of all maths marks plus the sum total of all physics marks plus the sum total of all your chemistry marks, wouldn't that automatically give me the sum total of all marks? So in that case, these two quantities would turn out to be equal. So as you know, any quantity divided by itself, let's say, let's just take a quantity, say 150 divided by itself, pardon me, yeah, would definitely only give you 1. So in this case, what's going to happen? We're going to have the same quantities in the numerator as well as the denominator, which would be equal to, as you can see, if it is greater than or equal to 1, we enter this if statement. So we will obviously be entering this if statement for the first time, and we are going to increment the value of z. So initially the value of 0, and value was 0 in fact, and now it's going to be 1. Now what's happening here is we have another if statement. So remember, if it was an else statement, we could have skipped it because we have already entered an if statement, but here we have another if statement. So now we have to go through the condition inside this if statement to see if we are eligible to enter this if statement as well. So this if statement says, if the sum m plus sum p plus sum c, that is the total individual marks, the sum of the total individual marks in all three subjects, that is maths, physics and chemistry, divided by the sum total of all marks is lesser than or equal to 1. Again, you see we have this called that equal to sign, which means that we would again be entering this if statement. So in that case, again we will enter this if statement and we will increment the value of z again. So now from 0 we have incremented the value twice, so which means that at the end of execution the value of z would be 2, and that would be your numerical answer. So for this question we would not have to have wasted time, which is the case for most of the other questions which are numerical, which we have to answer numerically. In this case, we just had to apply a bit of logic and find out that the sum total is equal to the individual marks, the sum of the individual marks in all three subjects. So in this case, this is your answer, that is 2. So anyway, moving on to question number 6. So the 6th question reads, the following pseudocode is executed using the scores dataset. At the end of execution, the variable count captures the number of students whose total marks are more than the class average, and I think I have to mark this here, whose total marks are more than the class average, which means the total marks, but have scored below the subject average in at least 2 subjects. So they should have scored below the subject average in at least 2 subjects. Assume that the variable average t or avgt holds the value of the average total marks. Similarly, the variables avgp, avgc and avgm, which I am assuming is holding the average physics, chemistry and mathematics marks, and yes, they're holding the average physics, chemistry and mathematics marks respectively. Choose the correct code fragment to complete the pseudocode, and here is given that it's a multiple select question. So let's get into the code. So the first line, you have this variable called count, which has been initialized to 0. Then you go into this while loop and you read the first row x from table 1. And then you initialize these variables a, b, c and d to false. Now we see that if x dot total is greater than avgt, then what we do is that we assign the value true to a. And if x dot mathematics is less than avgm, then you assign b to true, which means that we are checking if this person has got a total that is greater than the class average. which is the total marks, but we're checking only if this person has scored, say, his mathematics marks is less than the average mathematics marks of the class. Only then we assign